Welcome to Solutions with Courtney Anderson. I am your host and guide, Courtney Anderson. Thank you for being with me today. Today we are sharing episode number 148. This is episode 148. Wow. Oh my goodness. Of our show, of course, our daily show here, Solutions with Courtney Anderson. So thank you for being part of the community and being part of allowing us to get to 148 different shows. Today we have a program that is part of the Myth Warriors series. Our Myth Warriors series is where we are going to examine concepts and try to determine, is that potentially credible, something I might want to potentially believe or utilize in my own decision making, or is that just some sort of a myth? Is that some sort of a lie or fallacy? And we're warriors because we are out there and we are not just sitting around waiting to see what happens in life. We are assertively, powerfully, and confidently addressing, testing, examining, and exploring to find out, is this concept or idea a myth or not? I want to encourage you to come to CourtneyAnderson.com as always. That's our repository for all 148 shows as of this recording and all the other future shows that we have. Every single individual show has an individual show page. And so if you come to CourtneyAnderson.com and come to episode 148, which has the whole title, you'll see all the show notes and links and some attachments actually for this episode. So it allows us to sort of showcase and detail everything about the episode. It also is where we have a space for our sponsors. We have show sponsors as the show's grown, thanks to you, and become more successful than I even anticipated or dreamed. We've been able to incorporate it into our overall business plan and make it a much more im- I was gonna impressive. I was gonna say impressive business unit because that's actually where we are. So thanks to you, and thanks to supporting our show sponsors. So come again to the show page, courtneyanderson.com. And also I always encourage you to get out there on that social media, tell the world, share what we're doing here, and let people know. And of course, give us any ratings or feedback on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. So here we are. This show is, I'm going to be very clear on the outset, it's a difficult show for me to do. And let me tell you a little bit about why. So the show today, one of our Myth Warrior series, that's not difficult. I love Myth Warrior series. It's awesome. We have lots of fantastic shows that I've learned a lot while researching, putting together, doing, and then listening and growing from your feedback. This specific show's episode title is You Get No More Out of Life Than You Demand. You get no more out of life than you demand. So that's our show topic, and you'll see the authors. We do in many different shows. We have all types of authors. We have from just, I was going to, from literature, from politics, from philosophy, just wherever I have ideas and want to put together shows, then that's where we get all different types of quotes. So it's not unusual to do that, to have a quote as one of our show topics. The interesting thing about this one, our author of the show of the of the show topic today is Edythe Heslip. Edythe Heslip. In fact, her full name was Edythe Eulalia Boyd Heslip, and full disclosure, she was one of the most, I was going to say powerful influences, but I feel like that sort of diminishes the impact she's had in my life. She was my grandmother. She's my paternal grandmother, so she's my father's mother. And putting the show together, it's been on the calendar to do the show for a while. I sort of was overcome by by missing her recently when we tried to get this show completed and I just was unable to go on. But I know that today we're going to be able to get the show done, and let me just tell you, you're in for a treat. because if you knew her, then you know exactly and I'm not at all. This is not hyperbole. I mean the dynamo that that this wonderful person, educator, businesswoman, uh, that she brought to the world and still continues to bring to the world in so many ways. And that's why she's, of course, here today. So just like every other author or historical figure that we have quotes from, we put links and share a little bit. In the show notes, I really ask you to come to the show notes. I always ask you to come to the show notes, but please come to the show page, courtneyandderson.com. It's episode 148. You can find it by just coming to the shows, going to the audio show, radio podcast link, and then there's a list of all the different series. This, of course, is a Myth Warriors show, and then, of course, or you can just go to courtneyandderson.com, go to the search area, and put in episode 148. It'll bring you to the page, or put in her name. You can find the show page very easily, and on the show page, I've attached an interview that a historian did. And it's an interview that's archived right now at Baylor University. So Baylor University is a well-known a university in Waco, Texas, and that is the town that my grandmother lived and worked and enjoyed for many, many, many years. And that's the town that she left the life as we know it. She died and passed away in Waco, Texas, and so many, many, many years before that, she and her sister, my aunt Marjorie Pryor, who I'm doing other programs about. This is very emotional. These women are honestly the best. Whenever I get overwhelmed, and I'll sometimes get very, sometimes we get in that place and bad things happen and we think, oh man, look at all these bad things. And sometimes we get in a place and bad things happen and they just start coming, right? So a bad thing happened with your work, and a bad thing happened with your health, and a bad thing happened, with a friend, and a bad thing happened with the romantic partner, and it just sometimes it all hits you, and sometimes you feel like I just can't carry anymore in this, and this world is overwhelming. And sometimes it's not even that individual. Sometimes you read, you're reading the news, and you're overwhelmed. I know this happens to me. I'm overwhelmed by a famine, or a refugee crisis, or violence, or a war, or abuse, or a group being ostracized, and I absorb all of that pain, and I'll think, wow, this world, right? And and we've done other programs. One comes to mind. We did a show, and it was asking, how can I be joyful when all these horrible things keep happening, right? And whenever I get to that place when I just feel like, wow, I'm overwhelmed. It's too much. It's too heavy. It's too bad. It's too much. I'll think about these women. I'll think about, and these are very different women. So they're sisters. Edythe Heslip, the author of the show today, "You get no more out of life than you demand," the quote. And then her sister, my great aunt, called Aunt Marjorie. Um, Very, very different personalities. And, but they're kind of, when I sit there and I think, what's the one kind of pure, awesome thing that I can grab onto when I feel so overwhelmed with awful things. And honestly, it's certainly these ladies. So the quote, the episode is, "You get no more out of life than you demand." Our question is this a myth? Is it a lie? Fiction, falsehood, fallacy? Or might it be potentially credible, maybe even accurate? So as I was sharing, if you come to the show notes, if you haven't had the opportunity, obviously it's past now, for you to have met and learned from Edythe Heslip and her sister. As I was saying, Baylor University, which is a wonderful university, known around the world has many different programs. of great reputation, had interviewed my grandmother and actually my aunt, and multiple times, if I recall correctly. And so one of the interviews I have attached to the show notes. So when you come to the show notes for this show, you're going to see a PDF attachment and the link. So I put the link in the show notes and the attachment. What is it? It's a link to and the transcript of an interview with Edythe Heslip, who is of course the one who I've citing as my source for this show episode, right? So if you didn't have an opportunity to get to know her while she was with us on this planet as we know it, go read her interview. So again, it's at Baylor University's digital archives, and it was an oral interview, and so the transcription is there, and some other information, and I put it right there in the show notes because I think it'll bring to life what I'm referring to, and I think it'll also explain. Um, Sometimes people talk to me and they'll say to me, they'll be very incredulous. I had one person, I gave a speech one time, and I don't remember what year. It was in the U.S. I can't remember where. And I was in the airport after leaving, and I was headed to I don't even know where. And this is when I was traveling 300 days a year. So forgive me for not having the detail, but it was somebody in the airport that had been at the speech because it was some, big event, convention thing, something of that nature. And I had mentioned in the speech that I was a fourth generation college graduate on one side of my family and fifth generation on the other side. And just because the content of the speech related somewhat to education, so it makes sense. I was talking about my own experience with education and et cetera. And so I was in the airport, sort of waiting, to get ready to get on the plane. And somebody there was, oh, I saw you at the speech earlier. And I said, oh, and then they said something like, you weren't. They said something basically trying to ask me if I was lying or if I was exaggerating when I said that. Um, I was so many generations of college graduate. And I didn't understand the question because I thought, well, that's, no. I mean, my professional reputation, I mean, I misspeak or I say something incorrect but I wouldn't sit up there and tell a whole story about, my personal, easily verifiable, life experience and my family if it wasn't accurate. Like, why would I do that? And sometimes people will be incredulous about whether something like that I'll share as my life experience, or people will say to me, "Wow, it's just they'll make me feel that I'm a bit unusual, or sometimes that I'm so I love business, or I'm so some people say I'm assertive." And I think if you knew certainly both of my grandmothers. Now I have to be very fair because that'll be another show. My maternal grandmother, another college graduate, very powerful person. If you knew my grandmothers, then you would totally understand that I'm just a very diluted version of sort of my gene pool. I'm nowhere near as passionate, I think, in some ways, or as assertive, or nowhere near as powerful. Certainly, they had very different life experience due to when they were born and when they lived. Um, I'm not even, I'm sure, a chip off the old block, but I'm definitely, if you understood sort of that narrative of the family history, you'd certainly understand me more easily. And it's not something where I'm unusual. I'm exactly in a lot of ways, in a lot of really positive ways. I'm definitely, a product of my definitely of my two grandmothers in terms of being assertive, in terms of loving education, in terms of, I'm going to use the word zest for life, because these were very, very determined and strong personalities. Um, and again, I pale in comparison at all. I'm nowhere near as accomplished, I think, and certainly again as tenacious as they were. But if you didn't have the opportunity to get to know them, I'm very excited that I'm going to try to put together over time more complete information, so you can hear them, you can read and see what they said, and this Baylor University archive is a great way. When I was reading through it, the interview with my grandmother and my great aunt, so then I think it'll bring to life and make it clear, sort of where I get these ideas, a lot of them. And I think it also, like I said, it's very difficult for me to prepare the show. It's hard, but it also, writing, hearing someone's words, it brings them back. And that's why when we talk about authors and we do other programs, or historical figures, um, the power that your actions and your words and your ideas can impact the world. We all know this. Whether it's like Gandhi or whoever. So I really do want you to get a little taste of of a really amazing and unique person. So go to the show notes and click on the link, or download the PDF and sort of read and see a little bit of the author of the show concept. And I think it'll also help as I talk about some of the issues with this idea, right? You get no more out of life than you demand. I think it'll give you it's supporting the conclusions I'm coming to. And I'm going to go ahead now, and I do it in some Myth Warriors shows, not the majority of them, I don't think. Let's cut to the chase. It is not a myth. It is not a myth that you get no more out of life than you demand. I'm making the argument that it is accurate. And one of the things I want you, when you go read the oral interview from the researcher interviews my grandmother and my great aunt. One of the reasons they were interviewing them is because they had this really interesting life. They had in the show notes I talk about my grandmother was born in June of 1924. She was born June 25th of 1924. She passed away, left us as we know her on March 3rd, 2010. And so one of the things we talk about, of course, practicing the joy of Florida business. Gee, I love business, right? I've had this lifelong of little businesses, and and loving entrepreneurship and believing in it so passionately. I think a lot of it does come from the fact that actually both of my grandmothers came from backgrounds of entrepreneurs, had relatives, and grew up in themselves, um, whether it was rental properties or um, they were they fully were engaged in terms of of the business side of society. And so I think that's part of maybe where I get these really I got these formative appreciation and excitement and belief, in the power of being a business owner. So Edythe Heslip, born 1924. She was definitely a savvy businesswoman. There's in the interview they talk a lot about a funeral home that my grandmother and my aunt, but we're focusing right now on my grandmother. Um, they inherited, so it had been in the family already by the time my grandmother and my great aunt moved to Texas. They weren't born in Texas. Um, they were from Oklahoma and had a family tragedy. Their mother had passed away, and they moved to Waco, Texas when they were really young, so they're little girls. And they move in with a relative, with an uncle and his wife. And so by that time they came to live there, then this funeral home business was already up and successful. And so they grew up there. And so when you read the interesting, I think actually historically that's why the historian obviously was interviewing them. It really is interesting. This isn't just my own bias as a granddaughter, but the really interesting how my grandmother had this idea, right? You get no more out of life than you demand. But the thing is, she actually backed this up. She did demand how she wanted to be treated. And I mean, she, I think some of how her attitude in life of that she had value and that she deserved to be treated the way she felt she deserved to be treated. Some of it probably was, personality but some of it probably was related to the fact that when my grandmother and my great aunt were little girls, so their mother passed away and they moved from Oklahoma to Texas, and they moved in eventually with these relatives who owned this business, and it was a very successful business. And in the United States, they had um, hundreds of years of outright legal um, treatment of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, and certainly the descendants of slaves had been legally owned, and then after they were not allowed to be legally owned explicitly in the 1860s, then there became a 100-year period pretty much where uh, life for people who were um, African slave descendants, or who appeared to be, their life was really not, in most parts of the United States, many parts of the United States, it wasn't. It was very stressful, we'll say, because they had what they called Jim Crow, and they had systems in some parts of the country that were very entrenched, but certainly access to housing, to public services, to education, to um, businesses, restaurants, hotels. It was not at all available. And I think maybe that's why sometimes people ask me when I talk about education, or I'm discussing with something and I'm saying how, my grandparents' parents were college educated. And in my on this side of the family, on my that we're talking about the author of this quote, her grandfather was a doctor. I have to say this because I can hear her saying this. My grandparents went to college. And my grandparents, the Edythe Heslip, when you go read the interview, she talks about it. Her and my aunt talk about how their parents um, were college graduates and had taught at a university. They had a whole separate, in the United States, especially in this geographic part of the United States in the Southwest, they built basically two structures, sometimes three structures. So they had one system for sort of majority group, then they had another system for the black group, Negro color. They had different words, but the descendants of Africans. Um, and then they had in some places a third group for Hispanics. And in some places they had extra groups, different parts of the country, different groups, different times for um, some European immigrants, Irish or Italian. Some people had different issues for people who were the Jewish um, identity. I mean, it goes on and on. So, but it was extremely expensive. You can see, right? Because you build one system of universities for sort of majority group, and then you had another system of universities that were for these other groups. Um, so my grandmother in this oral history, which I know you're going to go to the show notes and read, which I really, it's honestly, she's one of the most entertaining people in this. The thing that's so hard is I think about all this and I try not to you compartmentalize things in life so that you can kind of get through each day. But I'm sad, but I keep smiling because all I can do is hear her voice, and she's one of the funniest people. I mean, seriously, like you, I mean, just like, and sharp humor, and like nothing ever got past her, and funny, and just, I mean, honestly, uh, both of my grandmothers, this is what I'm saying, like these were not people who had any hesitancy to tell you exactly what they thought and why they thought it, but with that perspective, right? So you're a black woman, and you were born in the 1920s. I think my other grandmother was born maybe at the late teens. It's a totally different life, right? I mean, and they're in this system which has these very, very serious racial, ethnic, and color issues, but also gender. I mean, how many college educated black women, by the time my grandmothers were, in their 20s and 30s, which is the 1940s, how many people were in their group? I mean, it's a tiny, minuscule percentage of people that were college educated black women then. It's a small percentage now. So when I say that they had a lot of self-assured um, qualities, they really did. And so this whole thing about you get no more out of life than you demand, again, you, even when you read the interview, you'll see the humor and sort of how my grandmother, my great aunt, um, it amazes me even to this day because in a lot of ways I understand obviously a personality, right? Like they knew what they wanted, they got out there and they made it happen, which I love, right? We talk about how do you surpass your goals. You have to understand so much of what I talk about, and so much of so much of what sort of comprises who I am and how I see the world is, of course, like you. We're just, so much of it is what we've learned. And so I had this experience of watching two grandmothers, both from very educated families, themselves college educated, um, at a time when it was just so rare. And perhaps part of that, the way they had they had a lot of opportunity. They had a lot of opportunity for anybody from any time. But when you read the interview, you'll see my grandmother telling stories. That because this funeral home business, they were very well off, and again, also this history where my grandmother, to the last time I to say the last time I talked to her wasn't the last time, but pretty close to that. Always remind you her grandfather was a doctor, right? So she had this experience of being, very fortunate. And they had means and resources. Now they were within this really difficult system of not being in the majority group, not being in any powerful group, in the gender issues and the racism and all of this. But they went out and did, I would say, almost everything they wanted to do. Now they were impacted, of course. I mean, my grandmother, my great aunt, they were both interviewed in the show notes. They both became teachers. Now I don't know how much of that is because they love teaching, but the problem I think was that if you're a college educated black woman in the 1940s, what jobs are available for you, right? So I mean, were you going to be a neurosurgeon? Were you going to be the CEO of a publicly traded company? Were you going to do these things? I know my Edythe Heslip, the author of the show episode, quote, "You get no more out of life than you demand." She loved politics. So honestly, I think if she'd not had the time that she was in, I think she probably, and I'm not exaggerating, she definitely would have been a politician, and she definitely probably would have been a really powerful one because she was powerful. And if she'd had that platform and access to those types of opportunities, she definitely would have used them. But I think when you were definitely a black woman born in the teens, or the 1920s, in the United States, you had limited options with college degrees. You're going to teach, and those were then they taught in these segregated these separate school systems, right? Because they built different universities, but they also built different everything, from pre-kindergarten through doctoral programs. They built these entirely separate parallel systems for the different ethnic racial groups and whatnot. So I think if they were alive today, finishing school, they would have probably pursued different options. All three of these women, they all became teachers, and I don't think it's all because they just love teaching. I mean, I think they would have taught in some way. Maybe they would have done some aspect of teaching, but I think part of it was that was kind of one of the only jobs you could do with a college education as a black woman in that time frame. It was almost 100 years ago. So what were you going to do, right? And they were going to use their degrees, and they did. It wasn't like you went to college not to have a career. Like, they all had their careers, and they all were very accomplished. And so, you get out there and you make things happen. And they all went to graduate school and or completed graduate programs. I mean, these were not people who didn't get out there and do, like I said, within the confines of what they could do. They definitely did everything they could and then some. So when you read the interview, you'll see an anecdote in the interview my grandmother shared, which she shared all the time, about how, because the town, this is Waco, Texas, which many people have heard of because there were some issues there many years ago now with someone in the U.S. who had a sort of a standoff with the federal government. I'm not getting into that debate at all, but it made people hear about Waco, Texas. But the time my grandmother was a young woman, so this would have been, around the early 1940s. There were the fanciest stores in town, right? So she tells an anecdote in the interview, and you'll read about it. How so these fancy stores, which were off limits, to people who weren't in the right, ethnic or religious or racial or color group, unless there might be some limited access through certain, different doors and limited access. But my grandmother tells these stories of how, and she definitely repeated these stories, because I think for her it was a way to show that even though the system said she couldn't go to the best store in town, and be treated with respect and be able to purchase something, because that's what these laws and customs did. I mean, people in many parts of the U.S. and many parts of the world, for different groups with the same idea, right? You're the excluded group. People, died for this. But my grandmother tells these stories how, because their family had so many resources, relatively speaking, largely from owning these businesses and real estate and other, that she was chauffeur driven, by the person who drove the limo for the funerals, and she went to the store and she shopped where she wanted and she did what she wanted, and That's accurate. She just had this very strong sense of self that she had value. I can only imagine, and sometimes again, I get overwhelmed. And I think two things. One, I think how grateful and lucky I am for the opportunity I have, where I can legally and culturally go to stores, go out to eat, shop, buy a house, walk around in an area, with exactly the way I look, with my color as it is and everything. And I'm so grateful that I have these opportunities. And so one of the reasons I think sometimes some people say to me, well, you just do so much, because I definitely believe in education. So I went and have a lot of degrees and I have a lot of different interests. Part of it is because I think, we should, as we talk about in the program, surpass our goals. So when I accomplish something, I don't just think, well, now I'm done forever. No, I have a new goal. And the other part of it is I understand how these opportunities, I'm the first generation in my family to have an entire life where I can go wherever I want. My grandparents couldn't, and my parents couldn't. Right? My parents were born in the 1940s and grew up under these systems. This is a very different life I've had, and I'm fully aware of it. So yeah, I'm going to go out and I'm going to learn and I'm going to work and I'm going to travel and I'm going to go to different places and see things and hear things because I'm aware of what an opportunity it is, and I also feel that I'm going to take it, and I'm not going to take it for granted. I'm going to walk in the door and go to the place and do that degree program, and I'm aware of the fact that it's just a fluke of timing that I'm able to do these things. And it's not, not in a totally hokey way, but in a way I also do it, for 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 them, the idea that they couldn't do so much of what they wanted to do. They certainly did everything they could and they did more than they were supposed to, but there were all these huge limits. And I have a chance and I'm running. It's like you got an open lane in a race. I'm taking it. So that's part of why we're here. And sharing episode 148. And it's also this idea you get no more out of life than you demand. And all of that, me explaining historically, people who aren't historical buffs. I love history. It was my undergrad minor was in history. I just love it. And for fun, I read historical novels, and so much of what we talk about in the different shows, I give different examples because I think it's us. History is a study of us. And it also, I think, brings into clarity a lot of these things that we might not have had the perspective, if we don't look at history. So when I talk about, this author saying of the quote, you get no more out of life than you demand. And then I explain to you this is somebody that under serious constraints did this. So, so as she got older, the relative that had run the funeral home that she had moved in when she was a young child had eventually passed away, and then she and my aunt took over ownership, and my uncle became a licensed mortician, and they ran that business. I mean, my whole childhood, and everything was about the funeral home. And then the happiest things, they were so excited every time they had a new customer. So and the customer would be, of course, a deceased person. So they'd say, we have a body, we got to go, we got a body. And, that means we have a new customer. So we got to go do business. And, my grandmother taught me in the show notes, I talk about this. I mean, about business, all kinds of aspects of business, hiring, firing. She, had used SBA, Small Business Administration loans, which are federal government programs in the U.S. for business owners. She always taught me about her. She always had a private banker, so she had went to what was the bank, the most powerful or awesome bank at the time, and of course a lot of this she inherited because she inherited the business, and then she'd grown up from the time she was a little girl in this life, right, of the very powerful business owner that was he was her uncle, and his last name was Boykin, so Uncle Boykin. So they talked about, he passed away before I was born, but my goodness, the shadow this gentleman has left, and it was largely because I'm sure he was a loving and interesting and wonderful person, but it was also because of he built this business, and it gave them this incredible lifestyle, and then the business was in existence all the way until about the last decade or so. My uncle has now passed away, and of course my grandmother's passed away. So it was a long legacy, and it impacted all these different options in life, right? Because there's all these resources, and then because of the business, especially when the height of it, apparently it was so powerful, right? Because they had a whole separate entity. So everything was parallel. So university was parallel, school was parallel, housing was parallel. Everybody had to live in certain neighborhoods depending on what you look like, and so was death. So the majority group people didn't go to this funeral home because they already had their other own funeral homes. But if you were in the minority group, you couldn't go to the other funeral home, so you went to this funeral home, and um, so my grandmother always, she grew up in that. It was a life of economic opportunity and certainly privilege to a large degree. And my great aunt also, and so she always, she had, part of it is what you'll see with people who had come from backgrounds with opportunity. You'll see this across the board anywhere in the world today. People tend to have sort of in a healthy way. I think it's a sort of confidence because you grew up with opportunity and you sort of feel like, well, of course I can. Well, of course I can go here. Of course I can do this. Of course I can accomplish this goal. So part of it's that, and it can be, I think, like I said, really healthy. Part of it sometimes can tip over to an unhealthy situation where people who are from backgrounds of opportunity will sometimes, unfortunately, fall into being narcissistic and having an entitlement attitude. Like, I'm entitled to this because, I come from a background of resources and I can call people. Yeah, I can call my personal banker. I can call, the local, politician. I can call other business people. Like, I can call people to fix things. And sometimes that, again, can become an unhealthy sort of narcissistic or entitlement problem. But on the healthy side, it does tend to sometimes give people, not always, it's not a guarantee, because you have people from backgrounds of means have no self-esteem and be very self-destructive. But you do see sometimes sort of an attitude, just an air of course it should work. Of course I can. Of course I can. And just in a healthy way, certainly my great aunt and my grandmother had that. Of course I can. Of course I can. So when you talk to them and listen to them, everything sounded totally reasonable. Well, of course you went to school, college. Well, if their parents had met and taught in college, come on, of course. Of course of course you went out and had a career as a professional. Of course. It makes total sense from the perspective, and when you're listening and that's your relatives, it makes total sense to you. Of course the historian from the university interviewed you, of course. And the weird thing is, so I've hung on to some of this. I know in the last couple of years I'd moved a couple of times, and I got caught on this thing. I need a private banker because my grandmother always had a private banker. It's like the person you called, she called at the bank if she needed something, or and she didn't deal with hassles, right? So whatever. I mean, I'm going to my private banker, and I went and found one because I sort of was like, that's the level of service I should have, and that's what my grandmother's had, and I fully expect that. And so, like I said, on the healthy side, I think coming up in an environment where you're used to accomplishment, right? So my grandmother's grandfather was, educated. Her parents were college educated. Her and my aunt, her sister, they were the only two in the family, the only siblings. They were, of course, were college educated. And then they also had the family finances and economic opportunities. So I think part of that does set up, it makes obviously, I hate the phrase common sense, but it makes sense, right? People who come from those kind of backgrounds, you often do meet them and they have that sort of sense of course I can do this. Why couldn't I? So one of the other things I put in the show notes, my grandmother would say, in addition to you get no more out of life than you demand, her point was, I think, though, really important because even though she did have a lot of privilege and opportunity, relatively speaking, she also was what many people would look on the outside and say, well, my goodness, you're a woman, and it's difficult today, as the time I'm recording this, for women to have parity and equality, economically, professionally. There's a lot of data and research on that. So imagine it, 80 years ago. And it certainly is an issue where if you're in an ethnic or racial background or color that the society wherever you live in the world doesn't think is awesome, then it can put huge challenges in your path of trying to get everything done in your life. And so even though it gives a very unique experience, right? For certainly this idea of you get no more out of life than you demand. I put in the show quotes another quote from Edythe Heslip that's she would always say, "Go for it, girl. Go for it." And the reason why she was such a powerful, incredible source is because she walked the walk. She did it. It's one thing for somebody who's never done anything to say, "Yeah, go do that." It's another thing for somebody who honestly, everything they've wanted to do, they've done. When they say it, then you think, "Yeah, well, I really do need to do it." And my grandmother taught me a lot about real estate and business deals. Um, she also taught me a lot about fun. When I said she was funny, that's part of it. She has a sense of humor, sharp, hilarious. I mean, funny, but also fun. I mean, she loved friends and fun, and she um, loved everything. She loved dating. I mean, her last husband had passed away many, 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 many years ago, and so, but I mean, she was dating, in her 80s. And she always put on, she styled her hair and she put on her makeup, and she was her. She had a very strong sense of who she was and her place in the world. And she had fun. I mean, she really did. And also that we did a show early on, and it was about regrets. Do you have too many? Do you have no regrets? And I say to people sometimes, I really don't have regrets. I have things that I'm working on and things that I hope go okay, and I have things that make me sad or things that hurt me, but I don't really have regrets. Like where I sit around and think, oh, I should have done that, or why didn't I do that? And I think part of that is for certainly both of my grandmothers, and certainly um, this grandmother. These women didn't have regrets about things they could control. I mean, they went and did things that statistically very few people in their gender and their um, racial group did at a time, and it was not at all normal. But they did it anyway, and they did it and did it and felt like I can do more. And certainly Edythe Heslip, the the author of this quote, "You get no more out of life than you demand." It's not demand in a mean way. It's not demand like I'm going to demand it. It's demand like I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to have fun while I do it. And she has her own way of doing things. And she's very certain. She has when she makes a decision, the decision is made. And but it brought her joy. She moved from one town to another town. They're very far apart, and it was, and I'm not kidding. She took the exact same floor plan she had in the house in this one town, and when she moved to the new town, she went and had the builders build the literally exact same floor plan. You rarely see people do this, but she knew what she wanted, and that's exactly what you're going to build, and that's exactly what you're going to do, and in a healthy, fun way, right? It's her house; she's paying for it. With a sense of joy and fun, and I mean fun. She loved cards. She loved dancing. She loved music. Again, she just loved life. She really did. I can't say there was anything she didn't do that she wanted to do that she could have done under circumstances. Again, if she'd been born in a different time, there's a lot I think she would have done because different opportunities wouldn't have been available. But under the circumstances, what she could do, she did all of it and then some and a little bit more. And so I share in the show notes that when I started doing television work in 2005, I'd go and be a talking head on cable television. She loved it because she loved sitting there. Like I said, she loved news and politics and anyway. So when she'd turn on her CNN or her MSNBC or Fox or whatever and see me on the show, she just loved it. And she could do that anywhere, wherever I was in the world, didn't matter because she could see that. And I called her after every one of those shows, and often they'd send a car service or limo or whatever. And I asked her, what did you say? What did you think? And her first critique would always be about the style of it because she was very big on, we talk about in other programs. You want to have that confidence and you want to convey to people, this is who I am. And so she would always make sure I got a good smiles in because you want to, show the teeth and show that energy. And then we talk a little bit about the content, but she got a kick out of it, and she'd call her friends, and they'd get a kick out of it, and so many things have happened, and it's hard now if I do a show because I don't have any, I don't have anyone to share it with like that, and so in this show notes, again, I really encourage you to ask yourself if somebody could be. And it was not a power group in 1924 when my grandmother was born, being a black woman. It's not actually a power group now in terms of the overall opportunities in society and representation in different options. But that's irrelevant. That's just data. That's the collective. You and I are individuals. So one of the reasons we do this series and on the whole show is to get good data, make information so that we can get good information and make good decisions. But you and I are not bound by anything. And we certainly aren't bound by what the group does. I mean, what the group does, what the group does. You are you. I'm myself. And when my grandmother said, "Go for it, girl," she really did mean it because she did. and, um, and she also talked a lot about not having any fear. I don't think she meant like she had no fear because she actually was fearful of weird things. Like she was fearful of like birds. Hey, I'm not going to ask. Can't ask now. So she had the thing with like flying things. But she meant, I think, in life, whatever your work is, whatever your love is, whatever your relationship is, whatever your joy is, she really didn't have fear when it came to that stuff. And I think it was a fantastic example. Um, as the show notes said that she was stubborn in the best sense of the word, and I do mean that. She really, honestly, because she was so decisive. And the thing is, I think, again, because she had that life experience of, she didn't have any doubt that it would work, whatever it was. Of course, she'd finish school. And that's something you'll see in families where you got generations of college graduate. Well, then everyone is expected to do this. It's like finishing, primary school. Of course you will. It's not even you don't even think whether or not you'll do it. Of course you'll do it. Everybody does it. You did it. Your parents did it. Your grandparents did it. I mean, so part of it was that. The other thing is she just had a lot of confidence in herself, and I do mean a lot. Now she again loved it. She loved her accoutrements. She loved her clothes and her things that made her feel good about herself. That she loved putting her hairstyle together and her makeup. But she definitely was someone who got out of life because I really do see in my perception that she did demand it, and she demanded it a lot of times in situations where it made no logical sense. Like, literally they would say, you can't come here to this store because you're not, the preferable racial or ethnic group. She did not care. She did it anyway. Now, part of it was she could do that because she had the power. She knew economically, and of course, the uncle that she had grown up with, and he had a lot of power because of his business. Even though it was all these layers of different segregation, and everything, money's money. And of course, the uncle that had run the funeral home that she moved in with, and then inherited the business from, he had done deals with all kinds of people. Maybe people wouldn't come be buried at his business because of the racial, ethnic rules or whatever, but his money went to the bank. They didn't have, I mean, he had access to levers of power because of the business. And my grandmother inherited that and used that too. Um, she demanded to be treated with respect, and she was. She wasn't treated with respect every second of every day. It wasn't like people weren't mean to her and people didn't say bad things to her. Of course not. Bad things happen in her life. Good things happen in her life. But overall, she had like a core sense of value of who she was. And she went out into the world and she taught people, this is who I am. Now I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And I'm going to smile and I'm going to enjoy it. And I'm going to have fun. And I'm going to play music and dance around my living room and play cards with my friends. And she just had so much of that sense of course you can. And she did it. So then everyone else, I think, sort of was like, well, of course we can. Um, as we're wrapping up, one of the things that we're doing, of course, the show's grown so much. We have our show sponsors. And the show sponsor here is Last Minute Travel. And the reason I thought this would be a good highlight for our show sponsor for this show today is, here's the deal. Um, my grandmother took cruises, traveled as much as she wanted to. Her sister, my great aunt, went to Cuba, obviously before uh, the changes in political system, but she'd gone there in the 1950s and had such a good time. And these women, they lived life. They did it. And so, no matter your circumstances today, I want you to just dream. You always start with that. And then, if there's some place you've never been, even if today you don't have the ability, you don't have the time, you don't have the resources, you don't have the travel documents, look at a travel website. And when you come to our show notes, I have this. Last Minute Travel is one of our show sponsors. But the idea is this: you got to get out there and demand it. You got to get out in the world. It may be another country, it may be another town, it may be another city, but you need to go. And you need to trust yourself that if you fall, you'll catch yourself. That sounds weird, but what I mean is it's not dependent on I shared that my grandmother had this great, at least economic opportunity after her mother died. So that was a very painful thing to her whole life. And they left her and her sister left where they were from, and they came to live in a totally different state with people they didn't, know as well. And it was not easy. And sure, there was wonderful economic opportunity, relatively speaking, that came through the relatives that my great aunt and grandmother moved in with and the success of their businesses. But, my grandmother was, had been divorced. She'd been widowed. Her husband died. She had a child that passed away. Um, uh, you know, I was going to say at birth. I mean, it wasn't like it was, sunshine and roses the whole time. But the consistent thing was, and other horrible things that have happened, that happened past that, But here's the consistent thing. Honestly, you have to decide what you want out of life. And I do get it that there are huge obstacles and constraints and all kind of stuff. Some of it's literal, like the law says you can't do it, or the custom is that no one like you's ever done it. Some of it's in your head. You believe you can't do it. And that's the part I'm talking to you about. You got to throw all that stuff out. It's garbage. You can do whatever it is that you decide. And you may be the catalyst that changes the custom or the law. We don't know. But you got to dream that life. And then you have to decide, I'm going to go out there and teach people to respect me because I respect me. And I'm going to do these things. You're going to be your own force in nature. And so that's why the idea of travel, you got to get out in the world. And if you go places and you realize, I went to that place, I didn't really like it, then you may not go back, but at least you went. It's about that. It's like, don't be that person who's like, oh, my whole life has passed me by and I'm 90 years old and I never went on a bus because I was scared, or I never went on a plane because I was scared, or I never got on a boat because I was scared. Don't be that person. Fear is just, we've done so many programs on this. Fear can be very healthy in a lot of ways as a sort of an attention getter. But in a lot of ways, fear immobilizes people for absolutely no reason. It's silly. You are uniquely you. It's your life. You decide. And then you're going to get out there in a healthy way. Demand is about boundaries. And it's also about remaining in control. Other people don't push your buttons. You don't let them. So if they call you bad words, who cares? If they say bad things to you, who cares? You have a lot more options. And when you have education and skills, and again, it doesn't have to be formal education. It doesn't have to be going to some university or college. It can be anything, but you need to get some skills, and you need to get a sense of confidence. You need to get basic business understanding, because no matter whether you're an employee or you're an entrepreneur, or no matter what you do, you're going to have to understand the basics of management, of getting stuff done, of self-discipline, of organization, of persuasive communication. All this is going to apply no matter what you do. And then you have to let people understand that you're not the victim because you refuse to be. And keep dreaming big, 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 big. And find those things that make you happy and do it. Because what a legacy you leave people when they think about you and they just think about you laughing and smiling and that, yeah. And it does bring a sense of solace, I have to say. Because it's, obviously we all want people that we admire and we love to stay with us, as long as they can. But it does bring a sense of solace, and I've had other experiences in life where it's not like this, but when someone leaves, the planet as we know it, but you honestly can sit there and say to yourself, you know what? There is nothing that they wanted to do that they didn't do. There was no stone unturned. There was no mountain that they didn't go out there and get out and climb. I mean, honestly, it makes life so much easier because it's like I miss them. And I wish they were here in that form that they were before with me. But I honestly can say that was it. I mean, whatever it is that made them, they did it. And they did it, that Frank Sinatra song. They did it, their way, right? They did it my way. And they really did it. And it's so much easier than it is when somebody denies themselves opportunities, and you mourn not just the loss of someone, but the loss of opportunity of what they could have done, what they could have been. It's much better when the person got out there and did it. And if they're fortunate enough, as my grandmother was, to live to be 86, it makes it easier, right? She had a lot of time. But there are people who, leave the planet at, you know, at 18, but they got a lot of living in that time. It's what you do with it, right? It's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. It is not a myth that you get no more out of life than you demand. It is accurate. That's that whole idea, and we do other shows on it, but no one can make you feel less than without your permission, right? You have to agree with it. So don't agree. Demand respect, value, attention, appreciation. And when you're around people and they don't give it to you, keep moving. I really, really appreciate you joining me today. It's a difficult show, but in a way it was a delight. And I'm really pleased that there's nothing I wanted to say or do or share with Edythe Heslip that I didn't. I said it all. I enjoyed every second with her. I hope you read on the show notes the oral interview, and you'll get a little feeling what I'm talking about a dynamic personality. And I hope in your own way you sit and you really do take responsibility. What is it that you know would make you feel good? And let's get rid of the things that would make you feel good that are unhealthy or illegal or unethical, and let's start figuring out how you can get out of your own way and unleash you know what's inside. Let it out. You're going to get that life, but you got to demand it. You got to tell people through your actions, through your consequence, through your behavior, through the way you carry yourself and the way you comport yourself. Mm-mm, it's not going to go with me. I will be respected. I will be acknowledged. And let's all get out there and do whatever it is that we can to try to make sure that when our time is up, that we don't have any regrets. If it was something we wanted to try, we tried it. If we decided we then didn't like it, then we knew, right? But at least we tried it. It's the trying. You got to get out there and sample life. It makes it more fun for one, but it also gets you in that situation where we're here for limited duration as we know it in this world as we are, but that's okay because we can get a lot out of that, a lot, and that's beautiful. So thank you again. And as always, come to CourtneyAnderson.com. Let me know what's on your mind. Thank you.